Snobby waiter laughs at elderly woman's order. She returns later in a Rolls-Royce. The restaurant hummed with the low murmur of conversations and the soft clinking of silverware against fine china. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved with practiced precision, their polished shoes gliding across the marble floor. At a corner table near the window, a young waiter leaned against the back of a chair, his sharp eyes scanning the room for his next table. His posture exuded confidence, almost arrogance, as though he belonged to this world of wealth and refinement, more than the patrons themselves. The glass doors opened, and an elderly woman stepped inside. Her coat was plain, her shoes scuffed, and she carried a handbag that had seen better days. Her posture was upright, but unassuming, her movements deliberate yet quiet. She paused for a moment, taking in the opulent surroundings with calm eyes before making her way to an empty table near the center of the room. The waiter's gaze landed on her, and his lips curled into a faint smirk. He exchanged a glance with a colleague nearby, who raised an eyebrow in silent amusement. Straightening his jacket, he approached her table with exaggerated politeness. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "May I recommend our chef's special today? It's a truffle-infused risotto, quite exquisite." The woman smiled gently and shook her head. "Thank you, but I'd just like a cup of tea and a small sandwich." His smile faltered for a moment, before returning, sharper this time. "Of course," he said, drawing out the words as though humouring her. "A simple order for simpler tastes." He turned on his heel and walked away, muttering under his breath just loud enough for his colleague to hear. "Probably can't afford anything else." The colleague chuckled softly, casting a quick glance at the woman before returning to their task. A few nearby patrons noticed the exchange. One or two smirked behind their menus, while others looked away uncomfortably. The woman sat quietly through it all, her hands folded neatly on the table. Her expression didn't waver. Calm, composed, as though she hadn't heard, or perhaps didn't care. When the waiter returned with her order, he placed the teacup and plate on the table with exaggerated care. "Here you are," he said with mock cheerfulness. "Enjoy." She thanked him softly and began to eat without comment. The waiter lingered for a moment longer than necessary, as if expecting some reaction from her, a complaint or perhaps embarrassment, but she gave him nothing. Frustrated by her indifference, he eventually walked away. As she finished her meal and reached into her handbag to pay, she caught sight of the waiter leaning against the counter again, laughing quietly with another server. His laughter was sharp and dismissive, punctuated by quick glances in her direction. She placed exact change on the table along with a modest tip and stood up to leave. Her movements were slow but deliberate as she adjusted her coat and picked up her handbag. For a moment, she paused at the door, glancing back at the room, the gleaming chandeliers overhead, the polished tables adorned with fresh flowers, and then at the waiter who had treated her so poorly. Her gaze lingered on him, for just a second longer than necessary, not angry or hurt but steady and knowing. Then she turned and walked out into the crisp afternoon air without another word. Behind her, the waiter smirked again and shook his head. "Some people," he muttered to himself as he picked up her empty plate. To him, it was just another day, at work. Another customer who didn't belong in his world of elegance and sophistication. But outside those doors, something far greater had already begun to unfold. The gates creaked open slowly, revealing a sprawling estate bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The elderly woman stepped out of her modest car, her worn handbag still slung over her shoulder. The driveway stretched endlessly toward a grand mansion, its columns and manicured gardens exuding quiet opulence. She walked with measured steps, her expression calm but distant, as though replaying the events of the day in her mind. Inside the house, an assistant greeted her with a worried look. "You're back early. How was lunch?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken concern. She placed her handbag on the table and smoothed her coat, her movements deliberate. It was enlightening. she said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. The assistant frowned, sensing something unsaid. What happened? She hesitated for a moment, then recounted the encounter at the restaurant, the waiters, sneers, the dismissive tone, the way others had looked at her as though she didn't belong. Her voice remained steady, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, disappointment perhaps, or quiet resolve. The assistant's face darkened with indignation. How dare they treat you like that? Do they even know who you are? The woman raised a hand gently, silencing her. It doesn't matter who I am, she said. What matters is who they chose to be in that moment. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the last rays of sunlight painted the horizon in hues of gold and crimson. A flicker of determination crossed her face. But perhaps it's time to remind them that appearances can be deceiving. The next morning, she stood in a luxury car dealership, her modest attire once again drawing curious glances from staff and customers alike. She ignored them all, her focus unwavering as she examined a sleek Rolls-Royce parked under bright showroom lights. When a salesman finally approached her with hesitant politeness, she spoke with quiet authority. I'll take it, she said, simply. Cash. Back at the restaurant, the waiter continued his routine with practiced arrogance. A young couple at one table hesitated over their order, and he rolled his eyes discreetly before offering them a patronizing smile. At another table, he dismissed an elderly man's request for a menu adjustment with thinly veiled impatience. His colleagues exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, their silence born of discomfort and fear of confrontation. Later that afternoon, as the restaurant buzzed with its usual lunchtime crowd, a low murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned toward the entrance as a gleaming Rolls-Royce pulled up to the curb outside. The driver stepped out first, opening the door with practiced precision. From within emerged the elderly woman, but this time she was unrecognizable. Gone were the plain coat and scuffed shoes. In their place was an elegant ensemble that spoke of understated wealth and refinement. Her posture was no longer merely composed, it was commanding. She moved with quiet confidence toward the restaurant's entrance, each step deliberate and measured. Inside, conversations faltered as patrons took notice of her arrival. The waiter froze mid-step, his smirk fading into confusion as recognition dawned on him. His colleagues exchanged wide-eyed glances, their unease growing by the second. She paused just inside the doorway, her gaze sweeping across the room until it landed on him. For a moment, their eyes met, his filled with shock and dawning regret, hers calm but unyielding. Without a word, she moved toward an empty table near the center of the room and sat down gracefully. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The Rolls-Royce glided to a stop outside the restaurant, its polished surface gleaming under the midday sun. Conversations inside faltered as patrons turned, their heads toward the entrance, curiosity rippling through the room like a silent wave. The driver stepped out first, moving with practiced precision to open the passenger door. From within emerged the elderly woman, her transformation striking and undeniable. Her attire spoke of quiet luxury, tailored lines, subtle embroidery, an understated elegance that carried more weight than ostentatious displays of wealth. Her posture was upright, her movements deliberate, and her expression calm but commanding. She stepped forward with measured grace, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, as though each step carried purpose. Inside, the waiter froze mid-laugh, his amusement cut short by the sight of her entering. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by confusion and unease. His colleagues exchanged wide-eyed glances, their discomfort palpable as they realized who she was. She walked toward an empty table near the center of the room, her gaze sweeping across the restaurant until it landed on him. For a moment, their eyes met, his filled with uncertainty and dawning regret, hers steady and unwavering. She took her seat without a word, her presence alone commanding attention. When he approached reluctantly to take her order, she spoke with quiet authority. "I'd like to speak to your manager," she said simply. Her tone was calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, his pride warring with his discomfort, before nodding stiffly and retreating to fetch the manager. The room buzzed softly with murmurs as patrons exchanged glances and whispered speculations about what was unfolding before them. The manager arrived moments later, his demeanor apologetic and slightly flustered. She gestured for him to sit across from her and waited until he complied before speaking again. "I came here yesterday," she began evenly, her voice carrying across the room without effort or strain. "Your waiter treated me poorly because he judged me by my appearance." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to dismiss them. The waiter stood nearby, his discomfort growing as he shifted from foot to foot under her gaze. "I don't blame him entirely," she continued after a pause that felt like an eternity. "Judgment is easy when you don't take the time to look beyond what's in front of you." Her eyes flicked briefly toward him before returning to the manager. "But I believe respect should be extended to everyone, regardless of how they look or what they order." The murmurs grew louder as patrons began nodding subtly in agreement or whispering their support for her words. The waiter's face flushed as he realized not only that he had misjudged her, but also that others were witnessing his humiliation unfold in real time. The manager stammered out an apology, his tone desperate to salvage both his reputation and hers in front of their high-profile clientele. "I assure you this is not how we conduct ourselves here," he said quickly. "I deeply regret your experience and will ensure it doesn't happen again." She inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, but didn't let him off so easily. "It's not just about me," she said softly but firmly. "It's about how you choose to treat anyone who walks through those doors." Her gaze shifted back to the waiter for one final moment, a look that carried neither anger nor pity, but quiet expectation. The tension in the room reached its peak as everyone waited for what would come next, for some sign of resolution or redemption in this unfolding drama. Then she stood gracefully, smoothing her coat before turning toward the exit without another word. Her departure was as commanding as her arrival, leaving behind a silence heavy with reflection and change that none could ignore. The room was silent, the tension palpable as the elderly woman stood at the center of attention. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the unease spreading among the staff and patrons. She glanced around, her gaze steady but not unkind, as though weighing each person's reaction before speaking. "I came here yesterday," she began, her voice soft yet commanding enough to draw every ear in the room. "I was treated poorly because of how I appeared, judged, dismissed, and mocked, all because I didn't fit the image of what some believe is deserving of respect." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling under her measured tone. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their own discomfort evident as they recalled moments of silent complicity. "But appearances," she continued, her eyes locking briefly with his, "can be deceiving." She paused, letting the weight of her statement settle before continuing. "I am not here to seek vengeance or demand retribution. I am here to remind you, and everyone listening, that dignity is not something earned through wealth or status. It is something inherent in every person who walks through these doors." Her gaze swept across the room again, lingering on faces that now carried traces of shame or reflection. "For those who don't know," she said, her tone shifting slightly, "I'm a philanthropist who has spent decades funding initiatives to uplift communities, initiatives that have benefited many people, including some who work here." The revelation rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Murmurs broke out among patrons as they exchanged glances filled with surprise and admiration. The manager's face paled slightly as he realized the gravity of her words and what they meant for his establishment's reputation. She turned back to the waiter, who now looked visibly shaken. His arrogance had crumbled entirely, replaced by a mixture of regret and embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but faltered under her steady gaze. I misjudged you, he finally managed, his voice barely audible. The apology was weak, half-formed, a reflection of his struggle to reconcile his pride with his mistake. Before he could say more, the manager stepped forward hastily, his tone firm but apologetic as he addressed both her and the room. This behavior is unacceptable, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. It does not reflect our values or what we stand for. Turning to the waiter, his voice hardened. You will face disciplinary action for your conduct. The waiter nodded stiffly, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The elderly woman inclined, her head slightly in acknowledgement, but remained composed. Thank you, she said simply. Her voice carried no triumph or bitterness, only quiet grace that seemed to magnify her presence further. She turned toward the door without another word, but paused just before stepping outside. Glancing back over her shoulder, she left them, with one final remark. Respect is not about appearances, it's about character. I hope you'll remember that. With that, she exited gracefully into the sunlight and stepped into her waiting Rolls-Royce. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving behind a room filled with silence and reflection. Inside the restaurant, patrons sat quietly for a moment longer than usual before resuming their meals, albeit with a new awareness that lingered in their expressions and movements. The staff exchanged uneasy glances before returning to their duties, their attitudes subtly shifted by what had just unfolded. The waiter stood alone near the counter, staring at the spot where she had been moments ago. For the first time in years, he felt small, not because of wealth or status, but because he had failed to see what truly mattered. Outside those doors, her departure symbolized more than triumph. It was a reminder, a challenge to rise above judgment and embrace humility in a world too often blinded by surface-level perceptions. The elderly woman stepped through the gates of her estate, the quiet hum of the Rolls-Royce fading into the distance behind her. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Inside, she removed her coat and placed it neatly on a chair, her expression calm but thoughtful. She glanced out the window toward the sprawling gardens, her gaze steady. A faint smile played on her lips, not one of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. She had done what she set out to do. At the restaurant, a shift had begun to take root. The staff moved with a new sense of awareness, their interactions more measured, more thoughtful. A young server hesitated before rushing a customer's order, instead offering a polite suggestion, with genuine warmth. Another waiter greeted an elderly couple with a sincerity that hadn't been there before. The air felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of judgment had been lifted just slightly. In the back room, the waiter sat alone, his head in his hands. The memory of her words echoed in his mind, calm yet cutting, each one peeling back layers of his own arrogance. He replayed the moments he had dismissed her, mocked her, reduced her to nothing more than an assumption. Shame settled heavily on his shoulders as he realized how blind he had been to what truly mattered. He thought about the other patrons he had treated similarly over the years. The quiet ones who didn't demand attention or flaunt their wealth. How many stories had he ignored? How many people had he judged without knowing them? The questions gnawed at him, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long avoided. The manager watched from a distance, his own thoughts clouded with regret and determination. He called a meeting later that evening, addressing the staff with uncharacteristic seriousness. Respect was not optional here. It was a standard they would all uphold moving forward. His words carried weight now, bolstered by the memory of what had transpired earlier that day. Back at her estate, the woman sat in her study, sipping tea as she flipped through a stack of letters from various charities she supported. Each one spoke of lives changed, communities uplifted, reminders that true worth was never about appearances, but about impact and kindness. She set the letters aside and leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a moment of peace. The restaurant continued its quiet transformation in the days that followed. Patrons noticed the difference, a warmth in the service that hadn't been there before. an effort to treat everyone with dignity, regardless of how they looked or what they ordered. The waiter began to change too. He no longer rushed through interactions or dismissed customers based on first impressions. Instead, he listened more carefully, observed more closely, not just their appearances, but their stories hidden beneath. The woman's actions had rippled outward like stones dropped into still water, touching lives beyond what she could see or measure. Her grace and wisdom lingered in those who had witnessed it firsthand, and even in those who only heard whispers of what had happened. And so it ended. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with quiet growth and reflection that left everyone involved just a little better than they were before. If you've ever been judged unfairly based on how you look or had to fight for the respect you deserve, your story matters. Share your experience below and join the conversation about breaking stereotypes, challenging prejudice, and fostering empathy. Together, let's celebrate dignity, humility, and the power of seeing beyond appearances.